Hello, I'm the Grub Street Vlogger, and happy May Day. I hope you've all been erecting poles and dancing around them and stuff. Whatever we're supposed to do in May. Uh, April, lovely month, really like April, but the books weren't that great this month, and I'll go through them, shall I? The first book was Daphne du Maurier, My Cousin Rachel. Now, Rebecca was probably one of my favourite books ever. I was completely gripped, and that bit at the end where you find out what's really been going on, I gasped. I was reading it, waiting for an Indian takeaway, and I physically gasped. No. And then that sort of queasy feeling where you're being narrated it by this person, you're being put in this position, and actually maybe the story is completely opposite to what is there. And in many ways, My Cousin Rachel tries to do that kind of thing. Again, it's that kind of idea. You've got this very heavily skewed narrator who thinks that his cousin Rachel may or may not have killed her husband, who's instantly another cousin of his. There's too many cousins in this book. And towards the end of the book, may or may not be trying to kill him with poisoned herbal tea. Dum dum dum. And I think it's said that Daphne du Maurier never decided herself whether Rachel was an evil, scheming, manipulative poisoner, or she was just a woman who just kept getting a really bad deal and ended up kind of looking like an evil, scheming, manipulative poisoner. Daphne du Maurier might not have decided, but I decided quite early on. And so the tension of the book, the sort of the big question that's supposed to get you through a lot of it, especially the middle bit, which is sort of soft and fluffy and doesn't really lead to much. You're supposed to be reading it going, oh no, Ambrose, no, Ambrose was the older one. Philip, don't be getting in with her. She's an evil poisoner manipulator, maybe. But I was thinking, no, she isn't. I spent the whole book just thinking, no, she's just this poor woman, and that she might have slept around a little bit in her youth, and she may made a few sort of selfish choices, but I really didn't think she killed her husbands, and I really didn't think she was trying to kill Philip. When he was ill, the doctor said it was meningitis, and it seemed to fit very much with meningitis. And when her husband died, it was with a tumour in the brain, and his dad also died of a tumour in the brain, and a lot of his symptoms seemed very real. And also, I couldn't see why she would kill them at these points. Why would she kill her husband before he had his will changed? And why would she kill this other character, the narrator, after she'd already got access to everything? And in fact, through killing him, would have denied herself the access. So I didn't see any reason for her to kill anyone. And she seemed really nice. And the narrator, Philip, just seemed like a cock. So I was never on his side, and I never believed him, and so there was no tension in the book for me. So I didn't enjoy it much. Because of that, I decided too early on, and it sort of influenced the rest. The next book I read for the Samuel Johnson Book Group. It's called London, A Social History by Roy Porter. Now, I really like Roy Porter. I really did not like this book. This book was so boring. Really, really dreadfully boring. And it was so boring that I basically didn't read for 2-3 days because I didn't want to read that. Because it's just lists, lots of lists of things. Lists of streets, lists of people who built houses, lists of jobs, lists of this, lists of that, lists of the other. Just lists. A review of the book said that they were in there to bulk up the runtime. I actually think there was a reason for the lists. I think they're there to show how big London is and how full London is, and just through the sort of excess of lists is supposed to convey the size and scope of London, and then feed into the sort of the through line of the thing that London is this massive city that's never really been properly run, I think is what he was trying to say with it. So yeah, I didn't really read for a few days, and then on Tuesday I was gonna talk about this with the group. So I spent the whole Tuesday reading it, and I managed to finish it 25 minutes before the meeting. In which case, half the meeting said they hadn't read it because it was too boring. We talked about it for about 15 minutes, and that was it. So I didn't really need to. It's very long. It's full of lists. It's a social history, so I was hoping for a history of, how people lived, where they got their food, how they got their money, how they budgeted things, all that kind of thing. What they did with their kids. But it wasn't a history of people. It was a history of the people. So it was just institutions and things like that. It was just very dull. Yeah. So I wanted to read a book that didn't bore me. So I read Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And you know what? It's by Gail Honeyman. This book did not bore me. I enjoyed this book. I related to this book. Not because I am a social lonely misfit with a terrible backstory, but because I wrote this book. Not exactly. This book came out in 2017. In 2006, I wrote my first novel, Me, Myself and Colin. Both books are first-person narratives in which the main character is socially awkward and in which we only see things through their mind. So the reader has to read between the gaps to notice how badly the character is doing socially. And that's where a lot of the humour comes from, when the reader clicks those two bits together. And also that style can sort of string things out and leave little details and bring them in for a comic punchline later. And so our books both do that. They're both about a complete loner who lives in their own mind, who has a crush on somebody, and then that brings them out of themselves. They get advice from somebody with a kind of old man's name. They also meet a separate old man who helps draw them into the world. By the end of the book, they give up an imaginary friend who's been holding them back. They go to parties, and their friend, who might be sort of their crush, is seen with someone else. Yeah, and the styles are really similar, like long sentences and then herky-jerky fragments and things. It was amazing how similar this book and my first novel are. The big difference is Eleanor Oliphant is 30 and my main character, Headingley, was 16. And so the explanation for his social awkwardness was that he'd simply never really needed to interact with society. He'd grown up living in his own imagination, and nothing had really meant that he needed to go beyond that. And so when he did, he was having difficulties. Eleanor Oliphant, she's much older, so they've got to have more of a reason for her to be socially awkward. And that's what the tragic backstory comes into it. And actually, I would say, I think my novel is better in that sense, because I don't think the tragic backstory really helps the book very much. I think it's a bit too weighty for the book. I think it's too nasty, and at times is almost comical. She rings her mum, and her mum is so unpleasant that I thought it was funny, and I don't think I was supposed to. And then when you find out the ins and outs and the nitties and the gritties, and it's all very, very heavy on a book that isn't. Whereas with mine, there is no tragic backstory really. He just is an awkward klutz and learns to be a bit better as he goes on. However, the addition of the tragic backstory in Eleanor Oliphant means that book motors on, whereas mine kind of meanders. It's very loose. I'm not proud of it now as a novel. It was my first novel. It's very much first go. But I was just amazed how similar these two things were and how successful that one was. I just got letters back saying, "We think this is great, but we don't know what to do with it," as I have with every succeeding novel since. Right, next thing, The Female Tattler. I thought I'd go old school again. This is 311-ish. It came out in 1709. You do the maths, because I'm rubbish at them. It's a gossip magazine. And what's really good about that edition, you get the original gossip magazine as written by Mrs. Crackenthorpe, who then moved to a different publisher And so you've got the original Mrs. Crackenthorpe's magazine with the new publisher, but then you also have the original publisher doing his own versions of the magazine with a fake Mrs. Crackenthorpe. Then the real Mrs. Crackenthorpe, something happened to her, and it was succeeded by what was called a Society of Ladies, who had a day each. And so these came out 3 times a day. They were essentially a mixture of gossip and sketch and sort of stand-up in some ways. And so it's all about, you get a long, well, they're not very long, but you get the longer article, which is sort of a funny thing, and then a couple of little ones, which are all look out for Mrs. Tattlewell on Bruton Street, who leaves her house at 9 o'clock at night and goes somewhere we do not know where. And it was read for the gossip, which these things are, but it was also read for the funny jokes and things. And some of the jokes were really quite funny. I really liked, there was a lot of fake book titles, and there was one called The Art of Lisping Beautifully, which included quotes like, yes, I think this is... I really like that. The original Mrs. Crackenthorpe ones get nasty. Like the gossipy bits become more threats. We know about you and we will say more. And the funny bits start banging on about the same thing. Obviously, Mrs. Crackenthorpe, whoever she was, and when this came out, it was thought she was Del Riviere Manley, but now people think maybe it wasn't, so no one really knows who it was. And that original Mrs. Crackenthorpe obviously had a great deal of trouble with the fact that the rich city people were trying to ape the gentry, and a lot of it is just taking the piss out of rich city people for not being posh right, and for the mixing the classes and fluidity. And it gets quite claustrophobic. She has quite a narrow view of the world, and then the Society of Ladies come in, and then you're longing for Miss Crackenthorpe because the Society of Ladies is a lot blander, it's a lot more generic. The names go from things like Mrs. Ticklepulse, who's a doctor's wife, to Arophilia, and it's like, well, and the stories turn from things that you think, oh, that happened, that's a real story that's been repurposed, to just generic romancy stories. It just becomes a lot flatter when the Society of Ladies take up. So in fact, my favourite of the 3 variations of the female Tatler was the second one, the fake Mrs. Crackenthorpe. I thought they were the most fun. But yeah, it was really interesting to see what people were talking about to each other 300 years ago, and how, the kind of language they were using and stuff. This came out 3 days a week. It wasn't meant to last up till now. It was meant to, it was meant to go off in 2 days, and now I was reading it now. So it was hard work, and given the hard work of the London thing, and the fact that Daphne du Maurier hadn't quite done it, and then Eleanor Oliphant, as far as I enjoyed it, reminded me too much of my first novel. It was, I was panting for something to just carry me away. That's what I really wanted. So then I read Elizabeth Taylor, Angel, not that Elizabeth Taylor. And this did exactly what I wanted. This was a really, really good book. And again, maybe one of the top ones of the year. This is going to be a hard, good list at the end of the year, because there's going to be so much vying for it. This is about a woman called Angel. And she is a writer. At the age of 15, she suddenly sits down and writes a novel. And she doesn't like to read. She's not really interested in people. She's very much not interested in the people around her. She lives above a shop. And she just likes to daydream. And her writing is her daydreamings. And the reviews that, or the hints of her novels that go on throughout, because she becomes a novelist with a big career, all implied that she writes novels that are full of errors, that are overblown, that are insincere, that are formulaic, that it says that she's obviously writing for herself, not her readers. She doesn't want to communicate with her readers. And she actually goes, yes, that's exactly it. And she thinks she's the greatest novelist ever. And for a while, she gets some traction, and people who want something not very demanding read it and love it, and it sells in huge droves. And people who know lots of literature, critics and things, get it to laugh at it. So essentially, 50 Shades of Grey. And so she then grows up convinced that she is this wonderful novelist, and it just charts her life, particularly her romantic life with this man called Esme, who's he's a painter. He's a painter who likes painting the drab and the sort of ordinary, completely opposite to her books, but they kind of mesh in this weird way, not always successfully. And it's about her life and how as her success fades and she becomes this peculiar, eccentric old lady and then dies at the end. So it fizzled out a bit at the end because there wasn't much plot to it. It was just, here's this woman, she's very interesting. And she was very interesting. And I really liked her, especially as a young woman, because she has this weird mix of absolute confidence in herself and no sense of humour or reflection on herself either. So if someone laughs at her, she'll take it completely seriously. But at the same time, at the back of it is this knowledge that she's great. And it was really good, and I really did enjoy it. And it was a very, very entertaining book. And that was all I read in April. See you at the end of March.